Okay, in a previous video, we saw how the process of glycolysis basically took apart a molecule of glucose and made two molecules of pyruvic acid. And this was part of a fueling process that was directed at the generation of ATP energy. We also pointed out that glycolysis took place in the cytosol, which is that part of the cytoplasm outside of the mitochondria. In the next phase of the fueling reactions, we're going to follow those fragments of glucose as they're then taken into the mitochondria where energy is going to be extracted from them further. But I promise you that we're not going to allow ourselves to get bogged down on details. Still, I think it's important to know how this process that occurs in the mitochondria of all the cells throughout the body is where all the oxygen that we take in gets used. This is the main reason why having a good respiratory system is vital for your fitness. The oxygen, O2, will be used to peck away at these carcass-like little fragments of glucose, eventually oxidizing them into pure carbon dioxide, that's CO2, and that's the final carbon-bearing remains of the glucose that we started out with. There are two main parts of this pyruvate degrading process. One is the Krebs cycle, and the other is the electron transport system. Your book refers to the Krebs cycle as the citric acid cycle, and I've also seen it referred to in textbooks as the tricarboxylic acid cycle, or TCA cycle. All of these mean the same thing. I just prefer to call it by the name that every biologist I know uses, which is the Krebs cycle. And while most of the details of what goes on molecule by molecule in the Krebs cycle and electron transport are really unimportant for a non-major biology student like yourself, there are some central aspects of these phenomena that you do need to understand. In particular, I think it's important for everybody to know why we need oxygen. That it's because O2 is ultimately the oxidizing agent that degrades the energy content of the pyruvates until there's really nothing left. The CO2s, remember that's what we end up with, represent a very, very low state of potential energy, whether you compare it with the original glucose or the two pyruvic acids that we have after glycolysis. Now remember that in glycolysis, it was the overall drop in energy level from the glucose to the two pyruvic acids that provided the energy that we use to drive a net yield of 2 ATP from 2 ADP plus phosphate. So sure, there was a drop in energy level there, and 2 pyruvic acids is less potential energy than glucose. But compared with the 6 CO2 that we end up with after the Krebs cycle, the amount of potential energy contained even in the 2 pyruvic acids is huge, and the drop in energy potential from there down to CO2 is a much, much greater energy yield and can therefore drive the production of lots more ATP. Thinking about this more carefully now, it makes sense why oxygen is so important to us. It basically allows our cells to squeeze every last bit of energy out of the glucose, and at the end we're left with a nice gaseous waste molecule, CO2, that can be expelled by our lung surfaces at the same time that we're taking in the oxygen from the air that we breathe. When I speak of oxygen here, I'm always referring specifically to the molecular form of oxygen, O2, as opposed to any compound containing the atom oxygen. Water, for instance, has H2O and is mostly oxygen by weight, but the oxygen in water doesn't have the properties that allow it to convert pyruvates into CO2. And in fact, oxygen, O2, that we use in the mitochondria turns into water as it gets used to wear down the pieces of glucose. The overall chemical reaction here is pretty neat. It's totally understandable to beginning bio student, and it captures the gist of our oxygen-dependent, that is, aerobic, metabolism of glucose, and it depicts the involvement of some pretty familiar molecules. If you just look at glycolysis, we start with a glucose and end with 2 pyruvic acids, and the drop in energy is enough to drive the synthesis of 2 ATP from 2 ADP plus phosphate. Now, if you look at the combination of glycolysis and the reactions taking place in the mitochondria, we go from glucose to 6 molecules of CO2 with a huge drop in energy, enough to account for as many as 38 molecules worth of ATP energy, though the actual yield is something more like between 30 and 36. But still, that's basically 15 to 18 times more ATP energy than what we get from glycolysis alone. In order for us to get all that additional energy, it's crucial that we have oxygen, O2, to completely peck away at the energy content of the glucose fragments that we had coming into the mitochondria. In the equation, we account for this by showing the need for 6 molecules of O2 for every molecule of glucose. Sometimes you'll see glucose represented by its molecular formula, C6H12O6. And on the product side of the reaction, we end up with 6 molecules of water, H2O, in addition to the 6 molecules of carbon dioxide. So at this point, we've accounted for the mitochondrion's use of oxygen in draining all the energy from glucose. And we've also accounted for the production of all this CO2 that we have to expel with our breathing out. But now we need to get a little deeper into how the mitochondrion uses this energy to drive the phosphorylation of ADP to make ATP. That's the subject of our next video.